All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 1832, President Andrew Jackson issued a, quote, proclamation to the people of South Carolina, asserting the supremacy of the federal government and warning that, quote, disunion by armed force is treason. That language is all to say, basically, hey, South Carolina, you're part of this union, whether you like it or not. Cut it out with all of this nullification talk and all this secession talk. And we'll get into the specifics of what exactly this nullification crisis meant. That is our topic for today. But one of the reasons we are doing this episode is because of something that Kellie said on a recent episode. We were having a conversation. I don't even remember which one it was. But Kellie said something like, many scholars think that the U.S. Civil War could have just as easily happened in the 1830s rather than a generation later in the 60s. And that is the question I'm about to ask Kellie right after I introduce her and Niki. Here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody. Hey there.
Kellie, can you guess what question I'm about to ask you? I'm about to ask you.
Pop quiz.
Could the Civil War really have happened in the 1830s, as you hinted at?
I mean, possibly. Like, all things are possible, I suppose.
Really backing off of her claim here.
Did they threaten it? They absolutely do. Like, the South Carolina is sort of known for maybe going rogue. And this was something that... Okay, let me back up. I think in order to have context, we have to understand that, like, slavery ran everything in the country, absolutely everything, even in the North, where you have all of, like, the manufacturing textile factories and you have all of the banking and insurance companies. Slavery just is the order of the day. It is how the South and the North, how the country is making its money. So when the country decides, Andrew Jackson in particular, to institute this tax, and this tax on cotton, which is the primary product that the South is selling, South Carolina is not having it. And they're particularly not having it because South Carolina is a moment where they basically have soil depletion. They have eroded the soils, not just because of cotton production, but also tobacco production. And they have an incredibly difficult time making a profit with cotton. And so they see this tax as really an affront on their economic and even their political livelihoods. And so, you know, the nullification crisis is their way of saying, like, no, you can't impose the law on us. We decide what's best for us. And then, you know, unless it's in a constitutional amendment, we can make our own rules.
And so the nullification and nullification crisis is basically Southern states, South Carolina being the main instigator, nullifying a federal law and basically saying we're not going to pay attention.
This doesn't apply.
We don't have to abide.
Has so many bigger implications. But one interesting thing, you know, and tell me if this reading is off, but it does feel like this question of tariffs. I mean, you pointed out the way that it gets acute in this particular moment because of soil depletion and other sort of economic factors. But it does seem like the tariffs were in place for a while, and any sort of, and you know, the U.S. like for a long time had imposed tariffs on goods, and foreign companies are always negotiating tariffs. We do that now. We have trade wars, we have negotiations, all that stuff. And so for a number of years, it didn't seem like this was a big affront. And then somewhere in, 1829, 1830, around this moment, the South decides to become upset, very upset. And I'm wondering how much of that feels like it's an economic response, or how much of that is like, we have a bigger fight to pick here, and this is where we're going to sort of pick it.
I mean, I would say part of the reason it's a problem for them is because they are, as cotton, they are the number one exporters of cotton in the world, really. All of their buyers are foreign. And so any little shakeup in that market is going to impact their bottom line. So even if it's just, of course the taxes are there, but an increase is no small thing for them. And so if they know that, hey, Great Britain won't purchase from them anymore if the tariff is higher, then they're going to fight for that because they see it as part of their livelihood. Now, the politics are definitely connected to that. That's how they go around the law, basically. But them being threatened financially is always at the heart of the case for them.
It's interesting because I do think that this 1830s moment is a turning point where if the Civil War maybe wouldn't have happened in the 1830s, it becomes, if not inevitable, like maybe the most likely outcome. Because at this point, you're seeing the bifurcation of the North and South. Both our economies absolutely dependent on slavery. But whether you're dealing with raw materials or finished products separates the kinds of economic decisions you're making North versus South. You're ending the era of gradual emancipation in the North. And so you really do have free states versus slave states in a lot of important ways. And this is, I think this is right, Kellie. This is the moment when the kind of defense of slavery, not as just an economic necessity in the South, but as a moral good, as the cornerstone of Southern civilization, where that argument really starts to take hold. You have the end of the slave trade, and so you have the emergence of this very robust internal system of slavery that's really taken hold by the 1830s. And now you have this crisis in which the vice president of the United States resigns because he wants to lead the opposition from South Carolina. Things have taken a turn.
John Calhoun. Yeah.
And not only that, you have this second forced migration in which you have now all this new virgin territory in states like Alabama and Mississippi because of the Indian Removal Act. So now states like Mississippi can be real competitors, and they do. I mean, in some ways they dwarf South Carolina in terms of cotton production and their ability to accumulate wealth. That South Carolina is worried, like our depleted soils are not going to allow us to maintain staying power in the way that like Alabama picks up and Mississippi picks up and even Louisiana takes some of that piece of the pie, piece of like cotton pie, if you will. So it's a real issue for them in terms of their like long-term sustainability.
Yeah. And the fact that it develops into this kind of constitutional argument or this legal argument about what Calhoun calls interposition, that that individual states, that state law and state authority is actually higher than federal authority and states can opt out. This is the nullification idea. Like that idea of being able to create a kind of constitutional and legal framework for protecting slavery without ever talking about slavery is also a really important development that lasts well beyond the end of the Civil War. Like interposition is something that's going to be used by segregationists in the 1960s. So this is a key turning point and a key moment in also the defense of slavery.
Yeah. But secession is something they threaten, which is crazy. It's not, we don't have to pay this tax. It's matter of fact, if you make us, we will leave. Which is like, what? But that kind of boldness, I think, has always been there. Even back in the Revolutionary War, when George Washington was like, hey, why don't you let your enslaved people fight and we'll compensate for them? They're like, no, we're not doing that. We're not letting anybody fight. No, not us. Count us out. South Carolina has always been about South Carolina.
So to mark some of the sort of key moments here and show how there's this really interesting evolution in the like basically, like, we're, largely talking 1828 to, like, maybe 1832, because there's two sort of tariff acts there, one in 1828, one in 1832, that sort of bracket a lot of this. And part of the objection is that they don't actually change that much, right? So in 1828, there's this tariff act that's passed, and South Carolina, along with Calhoun, who's vice president, but I think we know where his allegiances lie. They draft like a secret document objecting to this, basically saying we're not gonna do this. But they don't really make a big stink out of it until about 1830, where there's this showdown on the Senate floor between South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne and Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster, and that's where Hayne sort of starts to really say, like, we're not going to play along with this, and moreover floats that idea of, like, and you know what, secession might be something we're going to start to talk about. And that's where Daniel Webster famously says liberty and union now and forever one and inseparable. So you get 1830, it feels like pushing the envelope. Then 1832, there's another tariff act that doesn't really change things much, which gets South Carolina basically to say, like, okay, we're up against, we see where we're at. So part of my question, and maybe this is sort of where we start to understand this as a moment where, like, the Civil War could have happened. It feels like there's the economic conversation that's going on forever, and tariffs and trade and all that stuff. That's always going to have a level of tension. Now you add on top of it this, like, people are starting to openly talk about secession, right, and nullification. So that amps up the temperature. And then it feels like also, in this larger sense, there's just the sort of, like, the mask drops about what are we really talking about here. And this feels like, to me, a moment where it's like, we're really talking about slavery. And, like, if from having done this show, it feels like a lot of, like, the story of the 1830s, 40s, 50s is like all these futile efforts to not talk about the fact that we're actually talking about slavery and trying to talk around it, right? And talk about all these other things. But this feels like, and so maybe, that's why people say, like, this could have been the moment where it broke open, because it just kind of felt like the moment where, like, everyone sort of had to say, like, I see what we're really talking about here.
And it's also the moment when Andrew Jackson, in response to that threat to secede, says the federal government will use military force if you try this. And that, if I think that, one of the reasons it doesn't happen in the early 1830s is that South Carolina may not have the allies that it needs. And 30 years later, you have all these other southern states that are like, actually, you know what? Secession sounds awesome. But so it might have just been one state seceding, which might not have been a good enough recipe for a civil war. But definitely the ingredients of armed conflict are there.
And I think this is also the other southern states, if you're thinking about Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, even Texas to some extent later, they're doing fine. You know what I mean? Economically,
they're like, we're good.
They're like, we've got good soil. We don't have problems. Matter of fact, this is an Edward Baptist book. I think the largest number of millionaires at this point hail from the state of Mississippi. So, like, for them, it's a bump in the road, sure, but they're like, listen, you're exploding this. And so they don't get on board. It's not until you get, I think, where everyone feels like their way of life is threatened, not just attacks, but like their entire way of life, that the South can actually get on board.
Yeah. And, those are good explanations of the sort of larger context in which we walk back from the brink a little bit in this moment. And then, specifically, there are some new compromise bills passed. There's a bill called the Force Bill, which was fiercely debated, but then eventually passed 32-1 in the Senate. And then, South Carolina has a convention. This is all sort of in 1832, 1833, where they rescind their nullification order, but then they kind of like re-proclaim the principles of nullification. So there's South Carolina, again, kind of like stepping out a little bit. But, at least the temperature gets lowered a little bit. That said, I mean, to state the obvious, right, the two sides sort of walk away or whatever, or just sort of put their hands in their pockets and keep walking along. And Jackson, I think, his reputation sort of burnished by this, right? He navigates this crisis. The South is deeply embittered, right? And so we can see, like, the seeds planted, so to speak. And obviously that doesn't go away. And we see it explode again 20, 30 years later.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But-
we should do a whole episode on like the gag laws and how like they don't allow any
Absolutely.
anti-slavery literature into
Oh,
the
yeah.
South, and they became even more paranoid, and then you get Nat Turner's Rebellion
Totally.
and everyone's freaked out. Like, yeah, man.
Yeah. And so I mean,
Kelly's out there sowing the seeds for future episodes.
yeah, I love it. And but I mean that also I think brings us back to this large question of kind of how close was the country to erupting, and what does it even mean to be close? And I think because you've also mentioned a couple times on the show like this notion that's like the Civil War feeling like an inevitability, and the Civil War feeling like an accumulation of a bunch of little things that eventually there was going to be a straw that breaks the camel's back. In some way, you can see this as a moment where the dam almost burst, but maybe it's also more just kind of like this was a moment in which a bunch of straws were put on the camel's back, but it was still a slow, inevitable process over the course of 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. And I should say, I mean, the abolitionist movement itself doesn't really get started until like 1832, 33, but they don't start getting traction until the 1830s. And I think this heightens everything. All of the sentiment about like, you're trying to take our slaves really gets heightened after this moment too. I think if the abolitionist movement had started earlier, maybe South Carolina might have had more support or more allies.
And the abolitionists helped move the argument from the ability to have like economic arguments over tariffs to the moral arguments that will be a critical part of the movement.
Absolutely.
Kellie, did you say if the abolitionist movement had started earlier, South Carolina would have had more support?
Yeah, I think so.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
So the abolitionist movement is really kind of always there, but it doesn't become this official network across the country in which people are starting their own newspapers and getting mobilized, and it becomes like this force until William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator, 1832, 33. You start getting the American Anti-Slavery Society, the American Anti-Slavery Association. All of those things really take off and explode, especially through newspapers. There's like a huge drove of black newspapers that get started in 1830s and 40s and 50s. And so that mouthpiece is so important because it did not exist in that way. You couldn't circulate ideas as quickly about anti-slavery before this. There's like David Walker's Appeal, but it's
right. But you're also saying that the coalescing of the abolitionist movement also means that the South then coalesces in opposition to that?
Yes, because it wouldn't just have been about a tax. It would have been about a way of life.
Right. Got it. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. We have a couple other ideas now to put into our document.
You're welcome.
Yes. All right. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.